They boarded like everyone else, but they weren't treated like everyone else. She was young, quiet, respectful. He was just a kid, curious, polite, eyes full of wonder. They had the tickets. They had the seats. But they didn't have the look. From the moment they stepped into the first-class lounge, something shifted. Glances turned into whispers. Smiles faded into silence. And a flight attendant with a polished name tag and sharper attitude made it her mission to remind them they didn't belong, at least not in her eyes. But what happens when the people you look down on are actually standing above you? This is the story of a flight, a family, and a reckoning at 36,000 feet. And trust me, you won't see the twist coming. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been judged before you even spoke? Where are you watching from? Like this video if you believe dignity should never depend on appearance. Subscribe to follow the full series. Because justice? Oh, it's boarding now. The scent of polished marble and leather-bound privilege hung in the air like perfume as Arlena Royce stepped through the wide automatic doors of the Airline first-class lounge, her carry-on rolling soundlessly behind her, her left hand loosely wrapped around the strap of her brother Quillen's backpack. The 12-year-old boy, slightly hunched under the weight of anticipation and his oversized science magazine, stuck close to his sister, his eyes darting around the ornate interior that sparkled with wealth. Plush velvet chairs, modern art on every wall, and an espresso machine purring gently in the corner created a hush of entitlement that wasn't meant to be broken by newcomers who didn't look the part. Despite the tailored navy coat Arlena wore over her neatly pressed trousers and the calm, deliberate way she carried herself, she felt the air shift as they entered, a collective, nearly imperceptible tightening of the space around them, like the lounge itself recoiling just slightly. From behind the polished reception counter, Merelda Crane observed the pair with a look that began with curiosity and ended in quiet contempt. Tall, severe, and dressed in a uniform that fit her like custom armor, Merelda had worked at Airline for over 15 years and took deep pride in filtering out what she called traffic that didn't match the standard. Leaning sideways toward the junior agent stationed beside her, Merelda whispered in a tone coated in ice. Some teens wandered into the wrong lounge again. Can someone tell them where the food court is? Her colleague, a younger woman with a hesitant posture and clear discomfort on her face, said nothing, only offering an awkward nod as Arlena approached the counter with her phone already unlocked and boarding passes ready. "Hi," Arlena said, her voice clear but quiet. "We're checked in for flight 1147. First class. I believe we have lounge access." Merelda didn't extend her hand. Instead, she tilted her chin slightly, glanced at the screen, and then finally slowly took a single step forward, scanning the QR code as if the device might contaminate the scanner. After a pause too long to be normal, she looked back at Arlena with a tight-lipped smile. Our system isn't recognizing these seats. Stand by while we sort this out." The words came out laced with condescension, so thick that even Quillen blinked. Arlena held her composure. "Would it help if I showed the confirmation email?" she offered, raising her phone a little higher. "No need," Merelda replied, not even glancing at the screen, her hands now typing something beneath the counter with the theatrical precision of someone pretending to do more than she actually was. Sometimes these things get flagged. Did you recently win a promo ticket or get upgraded through miles? That can mess with the system, she added, her tone still calm, but now openly skeptical. "No," Arlena said, her tone even, her fingers tightening slightly around her phone. "They were booked directly. Both seats under my name." Merelda raised one perfectly shaped brow and looked down at Quillen. "This your little brother?" she asked flatly. Arlena nodded. "Yes. He's traveling with me." Merelda sighed, as if this made things more complicated. "I see," she said again, this time with a embarrassed roll of her eyes, before gesturing subtly toward a set of rigid metal chairs stationed just outside the lounge's frosted glass doors. "You can have a seat over there while I verify with the gate team." The seats weren't meant for first-class passengers. They faced away from a lounge, were cold to the touch, and sat beside a vending machine that hummed louder than it should have. Arlena nodded, gave a tight smile that masked her rising discomfort, and gently guided Quillen by the shoulder to the chairs, saying nothing more as they sat down. Did we do something wrong? Quillen whispered after a moment, his legs swinging off the chair. No, Arlena answered, her voice barely audible. We just don't look like what they're used to. Inside the lounge, Merelda returned to her junior attendant and said, not quietly, they say they have first class. I've seen this before. Probably someone used a friend's account or a shared reward system. She spoke as if she were reading from an internal handbook that justified her judgment. Arlena could hear enough to feel the sting without catching every word. The glances from nearby travelers told the rest. A man in a gray wool coat flicked his eyes over the siblings, then back to his watch. A woman adjusting her scarf muttered something under her breath and turned slightly away. The silence weighed heavier than any insult. 10 minutes passed. Merelda hadn't returned. No one had called their names. No one offered an update. Arlena stood and calmly approached the desk again. Excuse me, she said softly. Any updates from the gate? Merelda turned toward her with an exaggerated look of confusion. Still waiting, I'm afraid, she said, and then turned away without another word. Arlena didn't push. She returned to Quillen, who had pulled out his magazine but hadn't turned page. We could just go wait at the gate, he said, his voice uncertain. No, she said, forcing a smile. We'll wait here. It's what we paid for. She didn't add the rest, even if they don't think we deserve it. Arlena adjusted the collar of her coat and glanced sideways at Quillen, who had grown noticeably quieter since they were ushered away from the lounge. He sat still in the hard metal chair, his fingers locked together, the once glossy pages of his science magazine drooping loosely from his lap, as if even the illustrations had lost their color. Though she didn't speak, Arlena's mind churned, calculating the weight of each passing minute, replaying Merelda's carefully chosen words in her head like a courtroom cross-examination. The phrase, just until we double-check your seats, had felt polite enough in the moment. But now, seated beside a dusty maintenance door and under an air vent that hummed warm instead of cold, it sounded more like a sentence than a suggestion. The heat made everything feel thicker. Her coat clung to her back, her breathing became shallower, and the air around them carried the faint scent of industrial cleaner. A janitor exited the nearby supply room, pushing a mop bucket and eyeing them with casual curiosity before rolling past without a word. That single look, detached and disinterested, reminded her exactly where they had been placed, not as passengers, but as a problem quietly moved to the margins. She watched as other travelers breezed by, their rolling suitcases like elegant whispers across the polished floor, none stopping, none glancing back at the girl and the boy beside the service closet. 10 feet away, the automatic doors to the lounge hissed open, and a portly older man in an expensive camel-colored overcoat stepped through, his silk scarf swinging behind him. A junior attendant greeted him with a wide smile and walked alongside as a small electric cart pulled up to the lounge entrance, its driver hopping off to open the rear gate like a chauffeur. Arlena watched the man ease onto the leather seat and disappear with a soft whir toward the boarding gates. No scan, no delay, no questions, just access. She inhaled slowly, steadying her pulse. Her phone vibrated softly in her coat pocket. It was a text from her father. Boarding in 40. Let me know when you're settled. She typed back, still waiting. Minor delay. Then she locked the screen and placed the phone face down on her knee. Quillen looked at her and tried to form a half smile. He thinks we're on the plane already, he said quietly. She nodded, but said nothing. Across the terminal, laughter erupted from a group of businessmen in tailored suits, sipping espresso from takeaway cups, speaking in easy tones of confidence and control. The contrast only deepened the silence around her. A few minutes later, Merelda reappeared, her heels striking the floor like gavel knocks. She didn't make eye contact, only waved them forward without a word. Arlena stood, gathered their bags, and nudged Quillen gently. As they reapproached the reception counter, Merelda tapped something on the screen and said in a voice dry enough to chafe, "All right, looks like it's finally cleared. You may enter." Arlena raised her phone again, unsure if they were expected to scan again, but Merelda didn't look up. "Just go in," she said, motioning to the open door behind her like someone inviting stray animals off the street. Arlena thanked her not because she felt grateful, but because dignity didn't have to be loud. As the lounge doors closed behind them, the noise of the terminal softened into jazz once more, the world returning to its curated luxury. Quillen looked around in cautious wonder, his eyes darting between the rows of armchairs and the glowing buffet. They found a seat near the corner, close enough to the espresso bar to feel the cool air, but far from the center where other passengers had spread out like royalty. No one welcomed them. No attendant offered drinks. No menu was handed over. They were in the room, but not of it. Merelda stood across the lounge, laughing softly with another attendant, occasionally glancing toward their corner with a smirk that never made it to her lips. When a young white couple entered the lounge 15 minutes later, Merelda walked over with full ceremony, offering champagne flutes and warm greetings. She pointed toward the most spacious seats by the window and summoned a third attendant to help them settle in. Arlena watched it all silently. She didn't need words to understand what she was watching. The treatment wasn't accidental. It was deliberate choreography. Merelda didn't miss details. She didn't accidentally forget service. She chose silence. And in this place, silence was the sharpest blade. A man with a Bluetooth earpiece and an executive badge passed them and left behind a puff of cologne. He didn't acknowledge them. Quillen, whose hands had found their way into the sleeves of his coat, leaned toward his sister again and asked, "Are we doing something wrong by sitting here?" She looked at him, her expression softening. "No," she answered. "We're just not what they expected." After a long pause, he asked again, "Do they think we stole the tickets?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "I don't know what they think. But it doesn't matter. We're here, and we're staying." Outside, boarding for their flight was beginning. A screen on the wall showed their gate, now marked first class, now boarding. Yet inside the lounge, no one approached. No one notified them. Another family was discreetly escorted out by Merelda herself, their coats draped over their arms, a porter wheeling their matching luggage set. When Arlena checked her watch again, she knew they were already behind. She stood and walked to the counter where Merelda stood, speaking in hushed tones with a staffer. "Excuse me," Arlena said evenly. "Boarding has started. Could we be directed to our gate now?" Merelda blinked, her expression flat. "Oh, gate 5B. That's straight ahead after the lounge exit." She gestured lazily. "Though the cart may already be gone. You'll need to walk it." She said it with a smile that wasn't one. Arlena nodded, returned to Quillen, and helped him up. They gathered their things without a word, stepped out of the lounge, and began walking, alone, toward a gate they had paid to reach like royalty, but had arrived at like refugees. Behind them, the doors whispered shut again, sealing off the comfort they had briefly touched, but never truly received. Arlena and Quillen stepped onto the aircraft with measured steps, their carry-ons gripped tighter than before, their faces composed in that kind of practice calm only people familiar with microaggressions could wear without cracking. The entryway was softly lit and scented with eucalyptus, and a smiling crew member greeted passengers with rehearsed cheer. "Welcome aboard," she said, eyes flicking to Arlena, hesitating just half a second too long before turning back to a tablet. "Seats 2A and 2B, Arlena responded, gesturing gently toward her brother. The attendant nodded but didn't escort them. Others had been guided personally. A couple ahead of them had even been offered champagne before they sat down. As Arlena and Quillen reached their seats, a subtle discomfort began to sink in, not from the seating, which was spacious and designed with luxury in mind, but from what was missing. Every other seat in first class had a neatly folded blanket, a pillow tucked precisely in place, and a sealed amenities kit resting elegantly against the armrest. Row 2A and 2B had none of those. The headrests were bare. The footrests had not been extended. No pillow, no blanket, no kit. Arlena glanced around to confirm it wasn't a mistake, then looked down at her own seat, saying nothing. She adjusted her bag under the seat and helped Quillen settle in. The boy pulled his favorite science book from his backpack and placed it gently on the tray table in front of him, eyes lighting up at the thought of reading during takeoff. The moment of peace didn't last. Merelda Crane stepped into the first-class cabin with the presence of a gatekeeper returning to her castle. Her uniform remained crisp, her expression unreadable, and her eyes landed on Arlena and Quillen with that same slightly curled disdain. She walked past 2 rows, handed a glass of white wine to an older gentleman, and made small talk with a passenger in row 1. Then, as if realizing something was out of place, she turned and approached row 2. "Excuse me," she said curtly, not to both of them, but directly at Arlena. "Before takeoff, I need to ask that you refrain from recording video while on board." Arlena raised her eyebrows, unsure if she had heard correctly. "I wasn't recording," she said politely, her phone resting face down in the seat pocket. Merelda's gaze narrowed slightly. "We've had issues lately," she explained in a falsely sweet tone, "with people uploading footage from private cabins. It's disruptive to the privacy of other guests. Would you mind showing me your recent activity, just to be safe?" Arlena blinked, feeling her pulse skip. "I don't think that's necessary," she said, still calm. "The phone hasn't been touched since boarding." Merelda's smile was taut. "Well, if it hasn't, there shouldn't be a problem, right?" Her tone was less a question and more challenge. Arlena didn't respond immediately. She reached forward, took the phone, unlocked it, and held it without offering it. "Here," she said simply, showing the home screen. No camera app open, no recording history. Merelda leaned in, peered for barely a second, then nodded with a tone of fake satisfaction. "Thank you. Just doing my job." Then, as she turned away, her eyes caught Quillen's open science book. "Let's keep the surfaces clean for real use," she said, picking up the book gently but firmly and setting it back on his lap. Quillen's expression shifted. His hands held the book like it had just been confiscated and returned without explanation. "He was just reading," Arlena said, her voice level but softer now, knowing she wouldn't win this moment. "Of course," Merelda replied, walking away, as if the interaction had never happened. Arlena leaned back into her seat, every muscle deliberately relaxed, though her hands were clenched tightly beneath the blanket she had brought from home, thankfully. The aircraft began final boarding. A young family arrived in the last row of first class, all smiles and excitement. Merelda rushed over to assist, helping their children stow backpacks and fluff pillows. Moments later, she brought them snacks and headphones, items that had yet to be offered to Arlena or Quillen. Another attendant followed, offering dinner menus row by row. Arlena watched as the menus skipped their row. The attendant stopped at row 1, then moved to row 3 without hesitation. Quillen looked up. "Are we not eating?" he whispered. "They'll come back around," Arlena lied, even though she wasn't sure anymore. When the pilot announced the flight would taxi soon, Merelda re-entered the cabin, checking each passenger quickly. As she reached row 2 again, she paused and tilted her head. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, a shade too loud. Arlena nodded once. "Yes, thank you." Merelda smiled. "Wonderful," she said, then turned to a passenger seated diagonally behind them and spoke loudly enough for them to hear. "Some guests need extra time to settle in when it's their first time in first class." The comment wasn't subtle. The man chuckled. Quillen shrank slightly into his seat. Arlena didn't look back. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a pen and a notebook, flipping to an empty page and writing slowly, wordlessly. A list. A record. A quiet, internal act of defiance, even if her voice remained silent. She had said nothing because the moment didn't belong to confrontation. Not yet. Not here. She could feel eyes watching, some curious, some indifferent, some quietly amused, but not a single one questioning. The absence of witnesses willing to speak was louder than Merelda's condescension. Quillen shifted in his seat and gave her a glance, not a question, just a look, the kind that said he was trying not to feel what he already felt. She forced herself to smile at him. It didn't reach her eyes. Across the aisle, Merelda was already making another pass through the cabin, adjusting headsets that didn't need adjusting, asking select passengers if they were settled comfortably, only choosing to check in on those whose shoes were leather-polished, whose voices carried the practiced rhythm of old money. When she reached row 2, She slowed only for a moment, pausing beside Arlena's seat with a clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," Marelda said again, this time with a polite crispness that didn't match her eyes, which had narrowed into suspicion rather than courtesy. "I need to ask you again about your electronic devices. There was a guest who mentioned possible filming during boarding." Arlena turned to her, eyebrows raised, trying to keep her posture from tensing. "I've already shown you that nothing was recorded." Marelda tilted her head. "It's just a routine confirmation. We're obligated to investigate when another guest raises concern." Arlena glanced at the other passengers. No one was watching, no one seemed curious, and that, she realized, was part of it. The complaint, if it even existed, had been made in silence. Unverified, unchallenged, and convenient. "Would you like to see the phone again?" Arlena asked, tone even, not defensive. Marelda didn't respond right away, then said, "Actually, I'll just ask you to keep it powered off until we land. That should prevent any misunderstanding." It wasn't policy. Arlena knew it. But she nodded slowly, pressed the side button, and placed the phone back in the seat pocket in front of her. Marelda gave a satisfied smile and turned to leave, then paused mid-step and looked down at Quillen. "Let's keep trays clear during the climb," she said sharply, gesturing at his book, though the aircraft had already reached cruising altitude. "We're serving soon." Quillen nodded, his fingers quietly closing the book he had just reopened. He placed it gently in his lap, staring out the window without saying anything. Arlena watched him for a moment, her hand brushing his shoulder once. She didn't need to say anything. He already understood that none of this was his fault. And that was the worst part. The quiet understanding. He understood. He was only 12, and he already knew what it meant to be asked to be smaller. Marelda returned with water for the passengers in rows 1 and 3, moving past Arlena and Quillen, as if their row didn't exist. When another attendant walked by with the beverage cart, she stopped at 2C, then glanced at her manifest, and skipped row 2 entirely before proceeding to 3A. Arlena didn't ask for anything. She kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes watching the aisle like a chessboard, mentally noting every move. When the cart came back around with meal options, Marelda appeared again, carrying 2 silver trays with cloth napkins and real flatware. "We've had a minor catering error," she announced with faux sympathy as she approached. "Unfortunately, your preferred meal selection wasn't available, but we do have a light refreshment option." Arlena looked at the tray being placed in front of her. 2 crackers in plastic wrap, a small cup of fruit, and a sealed bottle of water. Quillen received the same. Around them, others were being served plates of roasted salmon, saffron rice, and warm bread rolls. "This is fine," Arlena said before Quillen could speak. She took the tray gently, thanked the attendant, and looked down at the dry crackers like they might tell her why this was happening. But she already knew. It wasn't about food. It wasn't about comfort. It was about erosion, the slow, deliberate carving away of dignity, bit by silent bit. For the next hour, nothing changed. Attendants moved fluidly through the cabin, always skipping row 2. Empty glasses were refilled, desserts were offered, hot towels distributed, all bypassing them with the consistency of a system. Not a mistake, a pattern. Arlena checked the flight tracker on the seat screen, which hadn't been offered any headphones for the in-flight entertainment, and watched the tiny airplane icon inch across the digital map. When the lights dimmed and the crew prepared for rest, Marelda passed once more, this time with blankets folded over her arm. She handed one to a man in 1A, then to a woman in 3B, and then paused beside Arlena. "I'm afraid we're short 1 blanket," she said with forced apology. "We'll bring another if one becomes available." She didn't look at Quillen. She simply turned and walked away. Arlena stared at the empty space where a blanket should have been, and then down at her own lap, where Quillen had quietly offered his without a word. She didn't take it. She placed it back in his arms and reached for her coat instead, pulling it around her shoulders. The cold wasn't the problem. It was the message, the idea that comfort was a resource she wasn't entitled to, that even warmth came with conditions. Later, when the cabin had quieted and the passengers had begun to doze, Marelda returned with a tray of teas. She placed one beside 1C and 3A, skipping their row entirely. Arlena turned her head toward the window, catching her reflection in the double-glazed glass. She didn't recognize herself, not because she looked different, but because she had never seen herself this still. Stillness wasn't peace. It was containment. She was keeping everything locked beneath the surface, not because she didn't care, but because she had to. Quillen had fallen asleep, arms folded against his chest, head tilted gently toward her shoulder. She adjusted his seatbelt without waking him. When Marelda passed again, she slowed her step, as if to inspect. Then she spoke softly, a whisper laced with mock concern. "You're very quiet, Miss Royce. If there's anything wrong, don't hesitate to press the call button." Arlena looked up at her and nodded once, her lips barely moving. "Thank you. I'll let you know." Marelda smiled, satisfied, and walked on. But Arlena didn't press the button. The lights overhead had dimmed to a soft amber glow meant to lull passengers into rest, but her body had no intention of sleeping. Her muscles remained coiled in restraint, her breath measured in deliberate control, and her eyes, though lowered, remained open, alert, and weary. Quillen had finally drifted off, his head gently pressed to her shoulder, arms folded like a makeshift barrier. She hadn't shifted since he'd fallen asleep, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to disturb even the illusion of comfort for him. He had been quiet all flight, too quiet for a 12-year-old. She hated that he understood, without her having to say it, how they needed to behave, how much of themselves needed to shrink just to make space in a place where they'd paid to belong. The tray table in front of them remained untouched, their light refreshment tray pushed neatly to the side, now cold. Around them, other passengers were asleep or halfway there, wrapped in blankets, eyes covered with silk masks, reclining comfortably with the soft murmur of jazz or nature sounds trickling from wireless headsets. No one had spoken to Arlena or Quillen in over an hour. No one had checked in. They had become invisible in a room full of light. It wasn't until footsteps approached again, confident and deliberate, that the silence was disturbed. Marelda Crane reappeared like a thought that refused to leave. Her arms were crossed behind her back, her heels silent against the soft carpet, her expression unreadable, but not unfamiliar. She stopped beside row 2, her eyes falling directly on Arlena. "Miss," she began, her voice low, but coated in that same condescending warmth she had used since the start. "I've been meaning to ask, is this your first time flying first class?" Arlena, who had been staring blankly at the in-flight map, blinked once and turned toward her. "No," she answered quietly. "I've flown it before." Marelda tilted her head, as if evaluating that answer against some unspoken truth. "I see," she said thoughtfully, then added, "Are you flying for a special reason today? Perhaps part of a scholarship program or a travel initiative for youth?" The words came wrapped in politeness, but each syllable landed like a stone. Arlena held her composure. "No," she replied, not elaborating further. Marelda raised her eyebrows, feigning surprise. "I ask only because we occasionally host young travelers through outreach programs. We even had a group last spring from the Urban Excellence Foundation. Lovely kids. Very respectful. Very grateful to be here." Arlena felt her breath tighten. "We're not part of any program," she said evenly. "We booked our tickets." Marelda nodded slowly, as if that answer needed internal translation. "Of course," she said. "Just wanted to be sure." She lingered a moment longer, then finally stepped away, leaving behind an air of careful dismissal that was heavier than any insult. Arlena stared straight ahead. She hadn't moved. She hadn't reacted. But inside her chest, something had shifted. Not cracked, not broken, just changed. She glanced at Quillen, still sleeping, unaware of the question that had been asked like an accusation disguised as curiosity. He didn't need to know. Not yet. She'd let him sleep. Behind her, a soft voice spoke, casual and amused. A man in 3C, whose sweater cost more than her entire suitcase, leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered, "It's kind of progressive, honestly. Letting kids visit first class. Gives them motivation." His companion chuckled softly and sipped from a wine glass. "Exposure is good for them. Shows them what's possible." Neither of them spoke loudly, but neither cared to whisper enough. Arlena heard every word. She didn't turn around. She didn't respond. The words weren't directed at her, but they were meant for her. In the artificial darkness of first class, where the lighting was flattering and the service was selective, her presence had been reduced to a teaching tool. A spectacle, a lesson in inclusion rather than proof of equity, as if her seat had been offered, not earned, as if her silence was gratitude, not resistance. A short while later, another flight attendant passed by offering refills of sparkling water and wine. When she reached row 2, she paused, glanced down, then turned and kept walking without a word. Merelda reappeared not long after, brushing past them to speak with the family in row 1, smiling broadly, her hands animated in light conversation. Arlena noticed how her tone shifted completely when addressing the couple, a warm familiarity, a touch on the shoulder, a compliment about the woman's scarf. As if they belonged to a world Merelda herself aspired to serve, while Arlena and Quillen had only wandered in by mistake. "Miss Royce," Merelda said, returning once more, this time holding a folded paper. "Your connecting gate in Boston is still confirmed, but I'd suggest you allow some extra time. Transfers can be tricky if you're not familiar with the layout." Arlena blinked. "I've flown through Logan several times." Merelda smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good for you." The conversation ended there, not because it had reached a natural conclusion, but because Merelda had gotten what she came for, the last word. Arlena turned back toward the window. Outside, the sky had darkened into a soft navy, pierced by distant city lights far below. She could barely see them. They looked like glitter on the edge of a forgotten map. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to stop herself from feeling. It was easier to endure when you didn't react. That was what they never understood. Silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. She could hear her father's voice in her head from years ago. "They'll test you without even knowing it, and you'll pass by never letting them see the answers." Somewhere behind her, laughter echoed again, polite and distant, but she no longer strained to listen. Her hand rested gently on Quillen's shoulder, who had begun to stir again, blinking against the low lighting, rubbing his eyes in that groggy way children did when waking up somewhere unfamiliar and unwelcome. She offered him a faint smile, one designed to reassure, even though her own comfort had been long spent. From the corner of her vision, Arlena noticed Merelda approaching again, this time with a passenger following behind her. An older man in his late 60s, dressed sharply in a tweed jacket, his suitcase wheeled casually behind him. They stopped just short of row 2. "Mr. Endicott," Merelda said in her signature clipped politeness, "we've had an unexpected issue with your original seat. It appears there was a misallocation. However, I can relocate you just here." She gestured subtly toward the seat beside Arlena. The man looked at the empty 2C seat, then at Arlena, then back to Merelda, his expression unreadable. "I assume this is still first class?" he asked, his tone low. "Of course," Merelda responded quickly, leaning closer and lowering her voice just enough for Arlena to barely catch. "They seem quiet. Might be your type." The man said nothing immediately, just nodded faintly, then took a step forward, clearly debating something. He paused again. "Actually," he said at last, "if there's another available seat away from, the kids, I wouldn't mind." Merelda didn't flinch. "Absolutely. I'll see what we can do." She turned without apology, motioned him back toward the rear rows. She said nothing to Arlena, didn't meet her eyes, and didn't acknowledge that the exchange had just happened within earshot. Arlena sat still, her face frozen in place, her expression unreadable, but her mind recording every syllable, every gesture, every omission. This wasn't about seating. It wasn't about comfort. It was about optics, about who was considered a disruption and who was considered a standard. Not 5 minutes later, another couple, middle-aged, pastel-clad, and smiling too politely, stood up from their seats and spoke briefly with Merelda near the galley. Their eyes flicked to row 2 more than once. Then Merelda returned, voice sweetened to perfection, and said to them, "We've had some seating concerns. If you'd like, we can move you forward near the bulkhead. It's a bit more consistent there." The man nodded eagerly. That'd be great. I think these seats were just cleaned differently. The tray table sticky. Marelda smiled and guided them down the aisle. Again, nothing was said to Arlena or Quillen. Their presence had been used as a problem to be solved, not as people to be spoken with. Their existence became the reason for inconvenience, and in silence, they watched others be rescued from proximity to them. Quillen leaned slightly toward his sister. "What's wrong with our seats?" he asked, not understanding. "They're fine," Arlena said. "They're just not fine for some people." He frowned. "But we didn't do anything." "You don't have to," she replied. Her voice was calm, but inside, the words burned. Marelda passed by again, not stopping, but giving a small glance toward their row as if confirming her rearrangements had worked. Behind her, the newly reseated passengers looked visibly more relaxed. One of them even smiled at her in thanks. Arlena looked down at her hands. Her fingers had begun to cramp from how tightly they were clasped together in her lap. She uncurled them slowly, flexing the tension away, and tried to focus on her breathing. She glanced again at the flight tracker. Still an hour and 42 minutes to go. She turned her head toward the window, but the view brought her no comfort. It was just black sky now, endless and silent. From behind, a voice, a woman's, brittle and nasal, spoke in a volume too high for a whisper and too low for a confrontation. "I just think certain experiences are meant to be earned," she said, speaking to someone across the aisle. "You open a luxury tier too wide, and suddenly it's not luxury anymore." Her companion responded, "Well, it's not personal, but when people don't know how to behave in certain environments, it makes it uncomfortable for everyone else." Another laugh followed, light and civil. Arlena didn't turn around. Her ears flushed with heat, but she stayed still. The worst part wasn't that the words were being said. The worst part was that everyone heard them, and no one objected. The invisibility had become collective. Everyone had learned how to look through her, how to act like silence equaled agreement. In first class, it wasn't necessary to say something cruel. It was more effective to say nothing while cruelty unfolded in front of you. When the lights flickered slightly as the crew adjusted for nighttime rest, Marelda returned again, this time with a set of eye masks in hand. She handed them to rows 1 and 3 with care, offering soft goodnights, then stopped briefly beside row 2. "Unfortunately," she said, "we've run out of masks. If any become available, I'll be sure to bring them." Arlena nodded wordlessly. Quillen didn't look up. The absence of things, masks, blanket service, had become the norm for them. What they hadn't been denied, they had simply never been offered. Arlena leaned her head against the side of the seat and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to think. Her father's voice echoed again in the back of her mind. "You'll walk into rooms that weren't built for you, and people will act like you're furniture that moved on its own. You'll think you have to speak to prove something. But the truth is, their discomfort isn't your burden. It's their mirror." She exhaled slowly. When she opened her eyes again, Marelda was gone, but her presence lingered, stitched into every interaction like bad stitching in a flawless suit. Arlena had begun counting seconds in her head again, not because she was anxious for time to pass, but because the act of counting gave her mind something to grip, something predictable, unlike the slow erosion of dignity that seemed to be happening in stages. Quillen stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes with one hand and reaching for the book he had tucked into the seat pocket with the other. He had barely opened it when Marelda appeared beside them once again, now with a tablet in hand and an expression as composed as always, her professionalism wrapped tight like the bun on the back of her head. "Miss Royce," she began, without preamble or pause, "we've run into a small issue with the in-flight meal system. Unfortunately, we're out of selections for your row. We can offer complimentary trail mix and bottled water, if you'd prefer something light." Arlena stared at her for a long second, not out of confusion, but out of necessity. She needed the pause to make sure her voice wouldn't shake when she spoke. "So no dinner options?" she asked plainly. Marelda kept her smile static. "The pre-ordered meals were distributed to the other passengers, and the remaining options are reserved for dietary requirements and passengers with status tier priorities. I'm afraid we've exceeded the extras." The language was so polished in fact, that it almost disguised the core message. You are not a priority. Around them, other passengers were being served their meals on porcelain plates with real silverware and folded linen napkins. A couple 2 rows ahead laughed lightly as they clinked glasses of white wine, and the cabin filled with the clatter of dishes being collected and replaced with desserts. Arlena glanced down at the small clear pouch now resting on her tray, trail mix, sealed in plastic, beside a room-temperature water bottle. Quillen looked up at her, uncertain. "I'm not that hungry," he whispered, even though he had eaten nothing all day except for a banana during the car ride to the airport. "Eat it anyway," she said gently. "You need something in your stomach." He nodded and opened the pack slowly, trying not to make too much noise. Marelda, satisfied with the exchange, turned and moved down the aisle, offering another passenger a warm croissant from the galley. Arlena didn't bother asking for clarification. She knew by now it was never about what was or wasn't available. It was about what was or wasn't being offered. She unfolded the small napkin that came with the snack, smoothed it carefully on her lap, and placed a bag of trail mix atop it, not because it made it taste better, but because it was the only gesture of formality she had left. Quillen chewed quietly beside her, glancing around as if trying to find out whether anyone else had been served the same thing. No one had. The difference was glaring, but no one acknowledged it. When Marelda returned again, it was under the guise of a health protocol. "Young man," she said to Quillen, "I'm going to have to ask that you keep your mask on unless you're actively eating. Some passengers have sensitivities, and we're trying to maintain a clean air environment." Arlena looked around instinctively. No one else in first class had their masks on. Not the couple across the aisle sharing a cheese plate, not the man in 3A who had been dozing with his mouth slightly open, not even the woman behind them who had been coughing intermittently since takeoff. "We're eating now," Arlena said simply. Marelda nodded once, as if satisfied with the reminder, then said, "Once you're done, please be sure to put it back on. It's for everyone's comfort." And just like that, she moved on again, disappearing down the aisle as though she hadn't just implied that Quillen was a threat to the air around him. Quillen didn't speak. He just looked down at the trail mix, then pulled his mask up over his nose even before he finished chewing. Arlena placed a hand gently on his arm. "You're fine," she whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong." He nodded, but she could tell the words didn't sink in. They couldn't, not when everything around him told him otherwise. The sound of cutlery against porcelain filled the cabin again. Dessert was being served, molten chocolate cakes, sorbets, gourmet coffee. Arlena watched without watching, her eyes glassy but her jaw tight. No one offered her anything. The menu that had passed down the aisle never made it to their hands. The pre-meal choices had skipped their row. The post-meal trays did the same. They were passengers only by ticket, not by treatment. A crew member passed by again. Arlena raised a hand to ask for water. The attendant nodded, then didn't return. Minutes passed. Nothing. Quillen had curled up again, coat around his shoulders. Tray table still down with the empty snack pouch and crumpled napkin untouched. Arlena slowly folded the napkin and placed it into the trash slot, then retracted the tray. Her hands felt colder now. Her feet were numb despite the plush carpeting beneath them. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just sat there, like part of the seat, like furniture. A presence too quiet to be threatening and too dignified to yell. The man across the aisle met her eyes briefly, then looked away. He'd seen. He knew. But like the others, he chose stillness. It was safer to pretend it wasn't happening. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight attendants began preparing for descent. The in-flight announcement came on, cheerful and automated, thanking the passengers for choosing Airlines and wishing them a pleasant journey. Arlena didn't react. She sat still, Quillen beside her, now half asleep again, his body curled inward like he was protecting something unseen. Marelda made her final rounds, checking seat belts and trays, nodding to certain passengers, offering silent affirmations that their needs had been met. The fluorescent glow from the cabin ceiling cast gentle shadows across her face, but it didn't soften the lines that had begun to settle there. She had said nothing. She had made no calls, asked for no justice, issued no correction. And yet, somehow, the atmosphere had begun to shift. Not by volume, but by tension. From behind the forward curtain, Marelda stood near the galley, poised and self-satisfied. The flight was about to push back. Every seat was filled, every instruction given. There was nothing left to control, nothing left to inspect. As she prepared to signal final cabin check, she adjusted her blazer, glanced at her reflection in the stainless steel panel by the jump seat, and smoothed a single wrinkle from her collar. The front door of the aircraft remained open only by regulation now. Boarding had technically closed 5 minutes earlier. The gate agent stood just outside, one hand hovering near the latch release, the other holding a tablet. The jet bridge was still, until it wasn't. The faint sound of deliberate heels against metal echoed through the narrow passage, growing louder with each step. The gate agent looked up confused, unsure of who was arriving at this hour. Inside the plane, a junior attendant walked toward the front to signal the final count, just as the cabin door hissed open one last time. Every sound after that seemed to fade. She stepped through slowly. One hand held a black leather clutch, the other draped with a dark charcoal trench coat, folded once across her forearm. Her dress was jet black, sculpted and tailored with precision, ending just below the knee. Her heels were matte, her jewelry minimal but unmistakably custom. The kind of presence that walked into a room without needing to explain who she was. She didn't scan. She didn't search. She already knew the layout. Her eyes moved with certainty, not curiosity. The junior attendant's initial reflex was to direct her to her seat with polite urgency, as they did with late arrivals. But when she raised her tablet and her eyes caught the name on the manifest, her voice caught in her throat. She straightened instantly, eyes wide, then shifted her entire tone and body language in a single breath. "Ma'am," she said softly but clearly, "welcome back. We're honored." That sentence, though not loud, traveled. 3 passengers turned to glance. A 4th peeked over his newspaper. A man in one straightened slightly. Marelda, still near the galley, blinked once. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She tilted her head for a better view, but only caught the back silhouette of the woman, slim, poised, completely at ease, as if she owned every bolt in the aircraft. Arlena had not looked up. She hadn't needed to. She had heard the tone shift. Her chest rose with a silent breath. She kept her eyes low, her hands still, her brother asleep beside her, unaware that the balance of the room was already tilting. The woman walked down the aisle slowly, her steps unhurried, deliberate, perfectly silent despite the hard heels. She passed the first row, then the second. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Quillen's curled frame, then to Arlena's motionless stare. She didn't speak. She didn't stop. She kept walking, the edge of her coat brushing lightly against each aisle seat as if marking her presence in silence. Behind her, the junior attendant stood frozen, tablet clutched her chest like a shield. A quiet murmur rippled across the first-class cabin as a few passengers leaned toward one another in curiosity, whispering names they weren't sure they remembered correctly. Someone finally said it out loud, breathless and disbelieving. "Is that Avanley Royce?" The name broke the room like a dropped glass. Someone inhaled sharply. Another straightened, reflexively smoothing their shirt. Marelda took a single step forward. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and concern. She hadn't seen the woman's face yet. Not clearly. She moved slowly around the aisle, trying to gain a better view. Then she saw her. Full profile. The jawline. The eyes. The unmistakable poise of someone who had stood behind podiums that decided billions. And in that second, Marelda's confidence cracked. Her posture stiffened. Her feet stopped. Her hands closed at her sides. Avanley Royce, the CEO of Royce Aviation, the architect of Airwind's international expansion, the woman whose signature appeared on every policy Marelda was trained to enforce, was walking her aisle. Without an entourage, without announcement, just presence. And from the looks of it, she hadn't come to fly. She had come to witness. Marelda inhaled once and adjusted her name tag out of reflex. Her heart pounded once in her chest. She opened her mouth, intending to speak, to offer some form of greeting, to recover the moment before it unraveled. But Evanley hadn't acknowledged her. Not yet. She hadn't looked her way. She hadn't needed to. She had already seen enough. The silence that filled the first-class cabin had shifted from strained discomfort to suffocating anticipation. Evanley Royce continued her slow, measured stride down the aisle with the precision of someone who did not simply walk through space, but who redefined it. Each step pressed deeper into the psychological floor beneath every passenger who had spent the flight quietly watching the subtle humiliations unfold and doing nothing. She hadn't yet spoken a single word, yet the balance of power had already begun to collapse. As she neared row 2, she paused, not out of hesitation, but by design. Her gaze landed gently on Quillen first, still curled half asleep in his seat, and then lifted to Arlena, who had finally looked up. Their eyes met with a recognition that required no explanation. In that moment, Arlena did not smile, did not react, but the tightness in her shoulders eased by a fraction. Her mother had not come as a parent. She had come as a reckoning. Evanley's gaze moved on, shifting toward the front of the cabin where Merelda now stood, stiff and pale, her professional facade beginning to crack at the corners. For a brief second, Merelda held her composure, but when Evanley took one more step and their eyes finally met directly, something inside her buckled. She swallowed hard, her throat visibly tensing, and forced a brittle smile. "Ma'am," she began, voice light but high-pitched, "I didn't realize," but Evanley didn't let the sentence finish. Her voice, when it finally came, was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, clipped, and lethal in its precision. "You didn't realize you were humiliating my children publicly?" The words froze the air like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. The temperature didn't change, but the sensation did. Conversations died mid-sentence. Passengers who had previously kept their eyes down now stared, openly. Merelda's breath caught halfway between her lips and her lungs. "Ma'am, I assure you," she stammered, her voice trembling now. "There was no intention." "No," Evanley said simply, and that one word shut the conversation down. It didn't accuse. It concluded. She looked toward the front of the aircraft and gave the subtlest of gestures, barely visible unless you were watching for it. A moment later, a tall man in a dark navy suit stepped into view from behind the galley curtain. His presence was quiet but final, the kind that made corporate doors swing open and department heads stand straighter. He carried a small black folio under one arm and an envelope in his gloved hand. Without waiting for introduction or permission, he stepped forward, unfolded the envelope, and began to speak in a voice that projected with restrained authority. "Ms. Merelda Crane," he said, pausing only to confirm the attention of everyone in the cabin, "effective immediately, you are hereby relieved of all active duties as lead flight attendant for Airline Flight 1179. This decision is pursuant to Executive Order Number 66A, authorized by the Office of CEO Evanley Royce." Merelda blinked, her entire body frozen in disbelief. She didn't move, didn't speak. She looked between the man and Evanley as if waiting for someone to correct the moment, to laugh and say it was all a misunderstanding. No one did. The man continued, his tone unchanged. "Please surrender your credentials and return to the forward cabin. Security will escort you from the aircraft prior to taxi." He extended the envelope slightly as if offering her a lifeline, but it felt more like a verdict. Merelda's lips trembled. "This isn't fair," she muttered, almost inaudibly. "They never told me who they were." Evanley raised a single eyebrow and tilted her head. "Their value was not something you needed to be informed of," she said evenly. "It was your responsibility to treat every passenger with respect, regardless of how expensive their shoes were." Merelda stood motionless. No one offered her support. No one stood beside her. The same crew who had once followed her orders now watched in silence. Their loyalty evaporated. The man holding the dismissal order waited with bureaucratic patience. Merelda finally reached up with a shaking hand, unclipped her badge from her lapel, and placed it into the envelope. Her hands brushed against the executive's, but he didn't acknowledge the contact. It wasn't personal. It was policy. The same way her actions had been. She turned slowly toward the front cabin, moving past the rows of passengers who no longer pretended not to see. Her posture faltered. Her shoulders hunched slightly. Her steps, once brisk and precise, now dragged like they carried weight she could no longer justify. Avanli remained where she was, unmoving. She didn't look back. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. When the door to the front cabin clicked shut behind Merelda, the silence in the room shifted again, not to comfort, but to consequence. Every passenger now felt what they had ignored. Every glance, every averted eye, every silence in the face of cruelty. They had all been complicit. And now the mirror had turned. Avanli turned back toward Arlena and Quillen, her expression unreadable, not soft, but not cold either. She studied them for a moment longer, then gently extended a hand toward Arlena, not to take her from her seat, but to offer a signal. The moment had come, not to defend herself, but to reclaim what should never have been questioned. The silence that trailed Merelda's exit clung to the walls of the cabin like fog that refused to lift. The hush wasn't gentle. It was judgmental, collective, suffocating. No one dared speak. No one dared shift in their seat. Every pair of eyes that had once flicked dismissively toward row 2 now found themselves staring at the empty aisle. Their collective shame disguised behind expressions of manufactured neutrality. Avanli Royce remained standing where she had been moments ago, her posture steady, her gaze sharp, her aura immovable. She hadn't blinked once during Merelda's forced surrender, hadn't shifted her tone, hadn't raised her voice. She had executed a complete reversal of power using nothing but presence, words, and timing. And she wasn't finished. Merelda's attempt to vanish quietly through the front was halted by a simple sentence from the executive still standing beside the galley. "Ms. Crane," he called, his voice calm but commanding, "your departure will not be private." Merelda froze mid-step, turning slightly, confusion laced with fear. "What?" she asked, her voice smaller than it had been since boarding. "Per executive directive," the man continued, "you are to disembark through the main cabin. Security is waiting at the jet bridge door." The color drained from her face. This isn't necessary," she protested. "I've complied. I've handed over the badge. This can be handled with discretion." Avanli finally turned to face her fully again. "Discretion is earned," she said with perfect clarity, "not demanded after disgrace." Merelda opened her mouth once more, but whatever plea she had prepared dissolved before it could take shape. Her eyes darted to the rows of passengers now fully watching, some with satisfaction, others with discomfort, but none with sympathy. She had spent the flight performing superiority like it was theater, and now the audience had turned on her. As she reluctantly turned and began the long walk through the first-class cabin, the energy in the room changed. She no longer walked with the authority of a lead flight attendant, no longer carried the grace of a professional in control. Her shoes no longer clicked, they dragged. Her shoulders sagged with every step as she passed the rows of tailored suits and designer scarves, past passengers she had once confidently served, past the 2 children she had deemed unworthy of first-class air. Merelda's eyes briefly met Arlena's as she passed. Arlena didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. Her stare held no vengeance, no triumph, only justice. And that, more than anything, broke Merelda. When she reached the cabin door, 2 uniformed security officers waited just outside. They didn't need to speak. She simply nodded, stepped onto the jet bridge, and disappeared from view. The moment the door sealed behind her, the captain made a soft overhead announcement, informing passengers that departure would resume shortly and thanking them for their patience. But no one heard it. Not really. Because everyone in the cabin knew they had just witnessed something beyond policy. They had seen accountability delivered not in rage, not in chaos, but in controlled precision. Avanli turned back toward her children. Her voice, when it came again, was low and private, audible only to row 2. "Come," she said gently. "Let's take you where you belong." Arlena rose slowly, gathering her coat and Quillen's bag as he stood beside her, still half asleep but now alert enough to understand that something major had shifted. The executive stepped forward and guided them past the stunned silence of the remaining passengers. The same seats that had once seemed to loom like thrones now felt hollow as they passed. No one met their eyes. A few looked down. A few looked away. No one said a word. They arrived at the front bulkhead, where a previously hidden panel slid open to reveal a private suite, a room within the plane, insulated from the rest, reserved for those few whose presence wasn't just booked, but protected. Inside, the lights were soft, the walls soundproofed, and the seats reclined into beds with plush bedding already prepared. The space was designed not just for comfort, but for peace. Arlena helped Quillen into the far seat, then sat across from him. She looked at her mother and spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. "You didn't have to come all the way here," she said quietly. Avanli folded her coat over the armrest, then sat with poise. "I didn't," she replied. "But it was important that they see who you are, and more importantly, who they are not." Arlena said nothing. She didn't need to. The message had been heard loud and clear. Back in the main cabin, passengers finally began to shift in their seats again. Conversation restarted, but it was different now. Measured, awkward, tense. The illusion had cracked. Some of them, for the first time in years, were no longer certain that money guaranteed moral ground. One man removed his eye mask and placed it back in its wrapper. A woman dabbed at her eyes with the edge of her scarf, though she claimed she was just adjusting it. A few dared to look back toward the closed suite door, but no one knocked. No one offered an apology, because the price of silence had just been made visible. Marelda was gone, stripped of her uniform, her title, her control. Not because she made a single mistake, but because she treated dignity like a commodity she got to distribute. And when the truth of who she had mistreated finally stood in the aisle with the power to decide, she realized that dignity wasn't hers to withhold. It was always theirs to begin with, and now so was the silence. The end. What did you think about that final twist? Did Marelda deserve her punishment, or was it too much? And where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. If this story shook you even a little, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories where justice speaks without shouting, and share it with someone who needs to remember. Power means nothing without dignity.